KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. And if you're a little close, you can hear the chimes in Pacific Grove telling us it is officially 8 o'clock. And with World Watchers beginning, because that is separate from the other program, of course, it is program number 756. It is June the 2nd, 1986. There is so much news out there that I could chop up the program and divert you from the theme that I want to have this evening. I'm mainly going to talk about the blast, the nuclear reactor that blew up or had trouble, whatever you want to call it, in the Soviet Union. But I do want you to know that there are many very big news stories out there. It's a temptation to not hit on them. I just briefly want to tell you what they are, and I will be getting back to them as soon as I can. They all involve what I call terror on the right. And also, Gaddafi is very much right-wing and pro-Nazi fascist, but he's made out as a scrubby terrorist that people confuse with leftist terrorism. The first story that I'll get to as soon as possible is the arrest of Franklin Camper in Alabama. He's from Alabama, where he has the training school for cutting off the ears and cutting the throats, written up in the last 2 issues of Penthouse and also a long article in the Wall Street Journal last year. He was arraigned in San Bernardino County for firebombing 2 homes of 2 nursery school teachers. Now, this overkill of 7 people indicted is a tremendous story that should have big consequences. It's similar to James McCord, the chief of security for the entire CIA, and for the committee to reelect the president being caught at the Democratic headquarters. It has huge implications that are going to take time to develop, but I'll give you stories on his arraignment and what came down in San Bernardino County planning to kill these particular teachers who left a specific nursery school, and the teacher called Camper in Alabama, and he came out with his team to get rid of 2 families. The other item that's important that is a 4-part story has to do with Israel, and you can't confuse those 4 separate sections of Israel right now. They are 4 different events that are very much in the news. One is the Israeli affair, the murder of 2 Palestinians that were taken off of a bus. It's already caused the change of the legal offices in Israel and has tremendous implications. The other is the story that's been carrying the news a lot, the plans to sell $2 million of weapons to Khomeini in Iran, and what would the Israelis be doing that for. The next story is one that broke this past week of papers that have come out of Iran, how Israel was betraying the United States and secretly sending nuclear capability to the Shah of Iran and sending it to the Shah. When he was deposed, that nuclear capability would be in the hands of Khomeini. And also the Jonathan J. Pollard story is very big. He was arrested with his wife. He worked with Navy intelligence for spying on the United States government for Israel. His co-partner in the spying story is Rafael Eitan, the man I mentioned so many times, who the head of the Mossad from Israel, who, along with Robert Ernest Kaiser, said in February of 1985 that they would bring in Joseph Mengele, and they knew that Mengele was alive in February, that June 1985 story is all a hoax. And also Jonathan J. Pollard links to Permindex and people involved in covering up the murder of John Kennedy, along with the Mossad. That's a very big story. Also, there was an arrest in Brazil. Pete Carey of the San Jose Mercury is covering that story and working on it. He's had a few articles. There are U.S. mercenaries, people sent out by Robert Brown of Soldier of Fortune, who also works with Mr. Franklin Camper, Americans using weapons from Argentina, and they were caught on a boat. There were 7 of them arrested. On the way, they said, to Ghana, and I believe they were really on the way to Angola or to overthrow the Brazilian government. They were arrested in Brazil, and I'll do more on that. And then there's been quite a few stories on the Contras and the evidence and testimony that's coming out now of the plans of the Contras, and those are our CIA freedom fighters, to murder the head of the American embassy in Costa Rica as an excuse to invade Nicaragua. These are very big stories and very important. Now, to lead up to the Chernobyl event, I want to say that Ronald Reagan and the CIA, and he does it better than anybody before him, uses situations that are agent provocateur situations and creates a climate for what he wants in terms of weapons for World War III, and that's what it is, as the Soviet Union said today, the suicidal plans of Ronald Reagan, that he's totally out of control. And three of the most gross examples of where he intended to escalate weapons, get weapon contracts, and so forth, came after situations that I believe were created and manipulated by Reagan and the powers that be as an excuse to ask for more horrendous things that Congress wouldn't give him otherwise. When the Korean airline went down with Larry McDonald, who was chairman of the John Birch Society and head of the Western Goals Group linked to the military and the police departments, immediately after that, September 1983, Reagan was able to get Congress to allow, and the military, nuclear warheads placed in Europe, budget for the MX missiles, new nuclear submarines that cost like $60 billion each, and Secretary of the Navy John Lehman only wants 60 of those, and the contracts for military that I saved right after the KAL filled large numbers of folders just because of that one event of the evil empire. After the Challenger explosion, the shuttle blew up, and they knew, the NASA people knew, it couldn't go in the cold weather, the O-rings wouldn't hold. After that horrendous accident, on the basis that 7 people had died, the emotional impact of these 7 dying, the next 4 weeks or 6 weeks in the newspaper, pushing aside the Rogers Commission investigation, were many articles: money for Star Wars, escalating the Star Wars, money for space stations, money for colonizing the moon and Mars, more money for turning the shuttle into military activities alone, and now there's more money to build another shuttle. Just when Rockwell and out in California are laying off people, Rockwell particularly, and Michael Deaver is a public relations man for Rockwell. If you read the LA Times this week, they're ready to fire and lay off several thousand people. But when they make the new shuttle and the Star Wars and so forth, these people will get their jobs back based on that. Now, after the explosion in the Soviet Union, as that nuclear reactor is going bad and the air is being polluted and the media is pouncing on the Soviet Union, Reagan announces just a week before, but finalizes the plan for what he calls third-generation weapons. With Edward Teller, there was the atomic weapons, then the hydrogen. Now these are the laser guns and the spray weapons of a combination of goodness knows what. And as soon as Russia had their problems, the same week, a day before the explosion was identified, Reagan was announcing that he would make 200 to 300 tests underground of the third-generation weapons in Las Vegas. We've done 6 this year that have caused a lot of controversy. He's announced he'll do up to 300. Very shortly, he has decided to throw away the SALT agreement completely, scrub 2 submarines, and then get billions to build more anyway. But this arms control is something he never intended to have. He throws that out the window at the same time of the Chernobyl to identify the mistrust of the Soviet Union. How can you trust them? Trust us. And now we got more arms because look how they lie to themselves and lie to us. And the news became a convoluted Cold War. Then he asked NATO, and I just briefly mentioned last week, we're going into the millions and millions of dollars for binary nerve gas, and nerve gas not manufactured since 1969, and when even Nixon came in, escalation of that. And now all the cancers in Europe for the next 20 years, he can blame on the Soviet Union, the reactor accident, not taking into account a lot of other things that have happened to people earlier, so that the nuclear weapons will escalate, the third generation new kinds of weapons, the binary nerve gas, the SALT agreement is thrown out totally, and it comes right after the explosion at the nuclear factory in Chernobyl. Now, the Soviet Union had an article that they published in Pravda, a letter that was important. Somebody called my attention to it this weekend, and you might have seen it in the Monterey Herald. It was also in the LA Times. It's titled, Pravda Sets a Precedent by Using a Protest Letter that was sent to them. And Pravda had an article, May 7th, the edition of their newspaper, suggesting the CIA arranged a recent bombing of a West Berlin nightclub that led to an American airstrike against Libya. It turns out now that the main suspect in that bombing actually came from Jordan, a Jordanian and a PLO with close links to possible CIA intelligence operations. And this in South Yemen was in the newspaper, and Pravda published this charge because there's a lot of information that the Berlin bombing was not done by Gaddafi, but that was our excuse to go into the Gulf of Sidra and to bomb Tripoli and another city in Libya. And Pravda published a letter of Richard Combs, the minister counselor in the Soviet Union, because our ambassador was away at the time, conveniently away. Ambassador Arthur Hartman wasn't there. And he wrote a letter to Pravda saying, I was astonished that you would put in your newspaper, the ruling party of the Soviet Union, lies, and he requested a retraction of the South Yemen news. And he said, these are fantasies, and Pravda objected to the tone of the letter. They published the letter, and they felt that he put in the letter, I'm going to keep an eye on what you write in the Soviet Union. And Pravda answered, since when does the United States Embassy consider it has a right to encroach upon the freedom of press and information and assume its role to censor of a censor deciding what should be or should not be published? Pravda asked, they asked that question, and it said, Pravda said, this is not the United States. They have information from South Yemen and from the PLO and from Jordanians that the CIA arranged the disco bombing as an excuse to get into Libya. And the American embassy says, how dare you? You can't publish that. We're going to see what you publish. And they reacted and said, since when did you tell us what to publish? This is what we think happened. Now, along those lines, May the 23rd, this past week, a very important Libyan, a former Libyan diplomat, was murdered in East Berlin Park. This was in the New York Times and the LA Herald, May 23rd, 1968. Bonn, West Germany. A former Libyan diplomat was killed this month in East Berlin Park. There was speculation that his death might have been tied to the investigation in the terrorist attack in West Berlin. And this sounds like a Lee Harvey Oswald who was killed by Jack Ruby, so that the connections of the military intelligence of the Defense Department to the murder of John Kennedy wouldn't come about. You say Oswald did it, and 2 days later Oswald is dead, and history is, for all purposes, is to think Oswald did it and not make a connection on his death and the fact that there was another story. The Soviet Union publishes an account in May the 8th, the CIA set this up, and then on May 23rd, this fellow from West Germany, he was living in West Germany, he was a diplomat in West Germany, but he goes back and forth between there and East Germany, and it was from East Germany that a telephone call went down to Libya saying, we're going to do this bombing in Berlin. And then after the bombing took place, another phone call came and said, we did it. We bombed that nightclub. And that was the basis upon which Ronald Reagan and none of the other allies, except Margaret Thatcher allowing our planes to leave from England, would get in on this story. There was absolutely no proof that the person doing it was not working with the CIA and setting up the excuse to do to Libya what Alexander Haig wanted to do and had planned to do since 1981. Now, the story is that the poor guy, his name is Mohammed Ashur. He was 42 years old. He left the embassy, the Libyan embassy in Bonn, and then from West Germany, and then went to East Germany, and they felt that he had been working with people who had been accused of doing the bombing of the Berlin disco, and that the blast at La Belle Club was attributed by the Reagan administration to the Libyan embassy in East Berlin, where this guy could visit, going back and forth. But his background was anti-Gaddafi. He was getting a doctoral candidate in political science at the Free University in West Berlin. He was killed in a park near the American embassy, but he worked with the people in East Berlin, and he could have been the one who used the telephone to make the calls. And then when he was connected by those people being apprehended for their role, and they're not Libyan, in the Berlin disco, he was killed on a bench near the embassy, and so that part of history will never be told. Now, I believe that the Chernobyl accident would or could be set up by agent provocateurs for any number of reasons, and I'll cite them and cite information on why I believe it. I'll do as much as I can this evening and continue it next week if I can't do the whole story. Just as I did after the Challenger went down, I think the second week after it went down, I cited 28 reasons in 1 hour why I thought it was meant to go, why it was allowed to go, and what would come of that particular disaster to the advantage of the Defense Department and the aerospace people. And later, as the story unfolded, they had every indication or reason to know that in this given temperature it would go, that the machine malfunctioned. It's a miracle it ever got up, and so forth. And I think the same thing happened because of the strategic timing of the Chernobyl affair. It had to do at a time when the president was going to the summit in Japan. He could use that when Radio Free America needed 21 million before July the 1st, and they were saying, look, with what we did at Chernobyl, we should be getting 21 million before the deadline, or else we'll take it from the Defense Department. It had to do with the reunion of the Sudeten Germans, former Nazis that moved to West Germany after the war. The Helmut Kohl meets every year. Right after that, he was meeting with them. And there were a lot of reasons for the timing at this particular moment that were used by the experts to get, or try to get, everything they wanted. Now, one of the interesting stories about this that is similar to the Libyan from West Germany being killed on a park in West Germany who worked with Libyans in East Germany, linked to the disco club, was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle last week, May 24th. Soviet officer dies, possible Chernobyl link. And this could be a punishment. The article read really strangely, but I've seen it in other military books the way it read. Moscow. Colonel General Leonid Goncharov, chief of the Air Defense Military Academy, died in line of duty Wednesday. Die Zvezda, the German newspaper, said he was 60 years old. The military newspaper, Red Star, did not give the cause of death. They say he only died suddenly while executing his services and his duties. As the military academy is in Kiev, there's a lot of speculation about Chernobyl and whether his death was involved with a nuclear accident. A Western diplomat referring to the April 26th accident at the facilities 80 miles north of Kiev. Goncharov joined the army forces in 1943. And there are many books on this time period of the merger of Germans with people in the Soviet Union, particularly those years when the Nazis went underground and recruited people who now work with our Central Intelligence Agency, with the World Anti-Communist League, with the Contras, who formed teams with Reinhard Gehlen inside of the Eastern Bloc and inside of Russia at this exact time period in 1943 when Russia couldn't be conquered. He was in this time period where he goes into the army. He rose from a student to a colonel general. He fought in the 2nd Ukrainian and Far Eastern fronts. And that area, the Belarus group in the Ukraine and in Minsk, that whole area was the nest of the future agents for the intelligence community for Reinhard Gehlen's operations after the war, Hitler's chief of intelligence East that became part of our CIA. He worked on the Far Eastern Front during World War II and was highly decorated. Just said he died in the line of duty, suddenly executing his service duties, whatever those were. But then another article followed, and some of the articles I'm citing this evening are from the newspaper, The Washington Times. A lot of people on the West Coast or people that hear World Watchers don't take this paper. It's a very inexpensive paper, and it's a good one to read. It's published by Reverend Moon, one of the founders of the World Anti-Communist League, which uses the Belarusian and the Minsk and the Eastern European Nazis for the purposes of starting World War III. And Arnaud de Borchgrave, the publisher of this newspaper, is a part of the Georgetown disinformation team that works with Richard Allen and Henry Kissinger and Jean Kirkpatrick and Michael Ledeen. And those people who use agent provocateurs such as Michael Ledeen and Claire Sterling lying about the Bulgarians, trying to shoot the Pope, trying to affect history by making a thread to the Soviet Union that didn't exist, even the trial of the centuries that they referred to as the trial of Ajah, this last one. So when I refer to these articles of the Washington Times, that's the background of the newspaper that Reagan reads the most in Washington. Now, this article is May 13th. Soviet disciplines 3 at Chernobyl. And this is about 3 people who were removed from office because from their jobs because of what happened. The article said the 3 men fired were fired. One thing was their handling of the underestimating the scope of the accident. They mishandled the evacuation and the large scope of the accident. Now, if they were responsible for summarizing how bad it was, this was the matter that got Mr. Gorbachev into so much trouble, and he literally was in a state of shock for a few days until he had interviews, and all these people were already out of office. By May 13th, they didn't have their jobs. They underestimated the scope of the accident, and it seems to me that anyone in the Soviet Union, any scientist, would be qualified who works with the nuclear industry or space and so forth. They would be qualified to announce to the world what happened, unless those people announcing what happened held it back for the consequences of what we saw later. These people did not talk about the radiation. It was part of the Belarus group in the Ukraine and in Kiev that they were silent about. They were supposed to help people evacuate, and they didn't do it. And the Washington Times says that there is a political fallout from the accident that could extend to the upper reaches of the Communist Party, that because of these 3 officers, the fallout will go further because of the chain of command, just as the Rogers Commission with the shuttle, fallout kept going up and up, even though some people said we shouldn't launch, others said we will launch, and it hasn't gone up to the White House. It doesn't move all the way up. But in the Soviet Union, the lower people, of course, are fired first. One of them, the manager, was Mr. Sisharenko and another Shapoval, and they were accused of doing nothing to help the people who were supposed to get jobs and get clothing, and they, in quotes, neglected the legitimate requests of the evacuees. One gentleman was expelled from the Communist Party. One was reprimanded. 2 of them lost their jobs. And another one from the trucking agency was reprimanded, but he wasn't fired. And Pravda said the collective paid dearly for the political immaturity, the failure to realize the situation by irresponsible managers. And I wonder if they were immature and if they were irresponsible, or if they were indeed trying to sabotage for the effect that came down. In Vienna, the headquarters of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the Nuclear Safety Division, they were assured by the Soviet Union that the fuel wouldn't burn through the reactor into the earth. But in Vienna, there is a nest of people giving out information on the Soviet Union that has been very damaging to the Soviet Union, and that is the home base of Mr. Waldheim, and you've been reading his track record in the papers lately. I hope you've been keeping up with that. And the home base of Otto Skorzeny, and the home base of Otto von Bolschwing, and the creation of the Fourth Reich, and again the war against Russia. Headquarters are in Vienna. The international fascist headquarters are in Vienna. That was one of the articles I found among my father's collections, was the offices in Vienna for the World Fascist Organization, and that's what Otto Skorzeny was setting up with Reinhard Gehlen, and he had all this information in his files about Vienna, and they also control information that comes out on the nuclear plants. Now, Reverend Moon's newspaper, Washington Times, had another article May 16th, which was a list of about 22 accusations against, or suggestions against, the Soviet Union, and this came out just 2 weeks after the tragedy, and hardly a time to analyze which way the wind was blowing, where the nuclear fallout was. And the person helping write this article was Alex Alexiev, a Soviet specialist from RAND Corporation and Defense Department. And I read the list, and I couldn't believe how quickly they could get out in one article all this material because of this terrible disaster and tragedy at Chernobyl, which luckily it wasn't us. We have 9 nuclear reactors like that. And this article, coming from our Defense Department, was really attacking them. The title seems mild. A shakeup is expected after a meltdown. Later it turned out it wasn't even a meltdown. But the article begins, the fallout from the Chernobyl disaster is already dissipating The political and economic repercussions for the Soviet Union are tremendous, the political and economic. Then it continues, the analysts say it will be years before the effect can be gauged by the outside world. You can worry about the Soviet Union and the fallout and cancer potentials for years. Then it said Mikhail Gorbachev's image has certainly suffered from his days of silence, and it could be that he could have spoken up right away but wasn't told exactly what happened and was trying to find out why these people had not told him, had not functioned, and could literally be in a state of shock from this. And they, of course, were saying his image has suffered. Instead of looking at the tragedy of the event, our country is worried about the image. What you look at is what you see. You want to look at an image, and if that image is slow in discussing something, which the Soviet Union does, sometimes it takes them years to share information, and we don't tell everything we know about our explosions or testing and what we've done above ground in the way of nuclear testing that we're feeling the effect of right now. The article said the Soviet attempt to place the blame on local authorities is unlikely to appease anyone except their own citizens. In this country, we blame it on the local small level, and we're satisfied with that. We don't chop off heads if it doesn't go to the top. So I don't know why the Soviet Union, they won't be satisfied with those explanations. It goes on to say that the Soviet leader now has the opportunity to purge the boss of the Ukraine party, and they mentioned him, and that he's one of the few holders from the Brezhnev era. I don't know why the communist boss of the Ukraine has to be purged, because the poor nuclear reactor went bad, but they're saying now it's time to change people, and maybe this is somebody they didn't want in, and they're saying you have to change, and they say now you have to get rid of the entire party apparatus because of the Kiev blast. I don't understand how we can write those things in America and assume that that's necessary in Russia. The article goes on, Moscow's relations with other nations have suffered, that we had trouble in the United States with the raid on Libya, but less than a week before the meltdown in the Ukraine, the Libya attack took place, but you can forget it now. It's out of the news. And, of course, Libya was wiped out. Ronald Reagan's mistakes of where he bombed and what he did, or the flimsy reason on why he did it, is all forgotten. They say, look, the tensions on Gorbachev and the NATO alliance now is more close together. He tried to split us, and he's objected to the nuclear testing and so forth, and so have they, that Gorbachev is not to be trusted, and so forget Libya, and the NATO people should be closer than ever. The article goes on, the Soviet mishandling of the nuclear accident makes the Scandinavians less receptive to the idea of a Soviet-sponsored nuclear-free zone. Well, it seems to me a nuclear disaster, whether you told the truth or lie, would be the reason to have the nuclear-free zone, not the fact that you had a reactor that went bad. But they say, forget it, the Scandinavians shouldn't touch the Russians. Then the article says the radioactive cloud has angered the European governments, including the neutrals. Radioactivity should scare anybody, and this idea, that we will build more nuclear. Ronald Reagan is saying we will have more nuclear weapons. We'll test 200 to 300 under the ground. We're going to use them, and why the world should feel safe that we have sent nuclear warheads all over the world and not reprimand Israel for even sending them or having sent them or wanting to Iran, where they could get into the hands of people like Khomeini. But when Russia has an accident, then we should make more nuclear weapons, because how do we know it won't happen to us? That was the excuse, to make more nuclear weapons because Russia had an accident. And the nuclear cloud was over Europe. Then it goes on to say that the Poles living in the western Ukraine were told, this article says, imagine their reaction to Polish broadcasts telling them things their own government failed to tell them. Well, our news media, Radio Free Europe and the U.S. Information Agency, were telling them 2,000 were dead, 36,000 were dead, everybody's going to die of contamination, your food is spoiled. And we bragged about our wonderful service aimed at Russia as soon as the reactor went bad, just as the same news services knew in advance of the bombing of Libya. And as soon as it was bombed in 2 cities, they were telling the Libyans, don't trust Gaddafi, you don't like him, have a revolution, get rid of Gaddafi. The CIA wants to get rid of him, so you get rid of him. And this is going on, the U.S. information agencies and the Radio Free America, and then it turns out that because of their service of telling the people In the Ukraine things that Russia wouldn't tell them, it proves that we have to have 21 million for these radio services in Munich, and it was set up by Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, because of the Chernobyl accident. Now the Defense Department, either you, the taxpayers, Congress, or the Defense Department has to give Radio Free Europe this money because of the wonderful thing they did at Chernobyl. I'll take a 1-minute break and go on to some more details of the Chernobyl accident. Just to finish up this article that was in New Times, there were more issues that were brought up that were one means of attack after the other about, as I say, the Europeans, the neutrals disliking the Soviet Union, the Polish people being informed by Radio Free America and not the Soviet Union. They said suspicions are revived that you can't trust Russians. Therefore, how could you trust the arms control? Well, if you can't trust them, then you may as well get rid of atomic weapons, both of you, and have some kind of a verification. Because what did the Chernobyl disaster have to do with verification? And then the next week, Ronald Reagan said, I'm throwing out arms control. The article continued that the pro-Soviet peace marches should be destroyed, that the Soviets are a menace to the environment, that Russians can't question their leaders like Mr. Gorbachev. We can't question Ronald Reagan. He goes to the 4th grade or the 6th grade of his school and has his answers on cue cards, and nobody can question Ronald Reagan at any single time. Then the article continues about the economic ills, the agricultural problems, and the fact that Russia will have to sell their gold. It turned out that the clouds went over the Ukraine and didn't fall on the wheat basket, and the food commodity market that was manipulated, and I'll do more next week, was totally out of keeping with what really happened, and the speculation of the food damages and so forth. The Wall Street Journal had an article April 30th, 4 days after the explosion and 2 days after the Western world knew about it, with a picture of Mr. Gorbachev, titled, Accident Gives Gorbachev a Host of Fresh Problems. From what I read in the paper, it's Ronald Reagan who's having the problems with Raymond Donovan and Paul Exalt and Michael Deaver, and the budget, the money, the excess debts that we can't manage. Our foreign trade is off. The banks collapsing, the farms closing, the pollution, no money to clean up the pollution, no medical health plans. I think our country has like 160 major problems I could list. And the Wall Street Journal is saying Gorbachev lost face in the world. Then they go on, it's a kick in the face for Gorbachev. Then another part of the article, weaker international position, and the scare in Eastern Europe about him, so that within 2 days of when the Western world knew about the accident, interestingly enough, William Martell from RAND Corporation from the Pentagon is writing the opinions for Wall Street Journal, and another Russian is Alex Alexov, is from RAND Corporation, from the Soviet Union, is writing for the Washington Times. So all of the vitriolic, angry talk about the Soviet Union is coming from the Pentagon that pays the RAND Corporation to write these studies. And this whole disaster, this nuclear disaster that we could have had, there but the grace of God, became a synchronized attack, just as when the Korean airline went down, against that evil menace about not trusting them. They lie. They blame the lower level. Your neighbors won't have anything to do with you. The Scandinavians don't want a nuclear freeze. The peace people shouldn't get involved with Gorbachev. And the hundreds of articles that came out in 1 month is just horrendous, and I've been separating them. Now, there's another side to this story that is very interesting. Shortwave radio in Moscow has had 3 broadcasts, May the 30th, the 31st, and June the 1st. The May 30th one, a friend listened to them and tape recorded them, and I transcribed what was on them. Shortwave radio Moscow, May 31st, this is Saturday, the broadcast, and this is 4 days after the world knew about the disaster, 6 days actually after it happened. The broadcast said, a rise in the level of radiation in the Federal Republic of Germany in early May, and this was May the 4th, it turned out, just 8 days after the nuclear reactor broke down in Chernobyl. In early May, local media hastened to ascribe to the Chernobyl incident. What really was a major breakdown at a nuclear power plant near the city of Hamm. This person didn't recognize it, and I wanted to look it up at the atlas in Germany and see where it came from. He wasn't sure of the spelling, but they went on and said it has been reported by the economic minister of North Rhine-Westphalia in Dusseldorf, Germany, that the power plant managers concealed the fact from the public and the authorities that the accident in the German nuclear reactor took place in early May and is still causing discharges of great amounts of radioactive graphite. The same kind of a nuclear plant that didn't hold in Russia was leaking nuclear material in May, just 8 days after the event in Russia. Shortwave Moscow, June the 1st. A nuclear reactor, this is a follow-up, at a power station in Hamm, Federal Republic of Germany, has been stopped after the management tried to conceal a grave accident that occurred the 4th of May last month. The accident resulted in a large-scale radioactive discharge into the atmosphere. The management claimed at the time that the sharp increase in level of radiation supposedly registered in the region of Hamm was due to the accident at Chernobyl nuclear plant in the Soviet Union. It took experts almost 1 month to even deny the claim that this happened, but while they were denying it, has been now discussed on Radio Moscow that a nuclear plant was leaking this radiation out of Germany 8 days after the Chernobyl accident, and Germany was acting holier than thou within 2 weeks of the accident. Now, the Washington Times, again, Reverend Moon's paper, and Moon was one of the founders, as I say, of the World Anti-Communist League, which is a hotbed of Nazis from Germany and from fascists from Southeast Asia and Taiwan and Japan. They had a long article, March the 19th, and in the box it cites, with the exception of the atomic explosions in Japan. It doesn't say, with the exception of when America unleashed plutonium and uranium into Nagasaki and Hiroshima. That was an atomic explosion. Those weren't bombs against families and not soldiers, homes and women and children. They referred to an explosion. They said the Chernobyl accident is equal to all radiation exposure accidents, and many of these go back 20 to 30 years. That's Dr. Robert Gale, who went to the Soviet Union to, in quotes, help them with the disaster and came home as a tremendous propagandist. He is saying that is, with the exception of what we dropped in Japan, the Chernobyl was equal to the exposure of all the past accidents. But he doesn't say the past testing, whether it was Nevada, whether it was in the atolls in the Pacific, on the islands, whether it was the French testing of weapons at the time the Greenpeace ship was dropped. They have testing over the ground. We have dropped so much of the atomic particles, and the incidences of cancer today could be coming from what we dropped. He's talking about accidents, but he doesn't use the word test, the atomic test, and the actual bombing that we did. He's careful to add up the accidents. Well, there weren't that many accidents, but there were lots of tests. And that, again, is coming from Reverend Moon. But along the lines of the World Anti-Communist League and the papers that Reverend Moon is putting out on this incident, Helmut Kohl was whipping up a story which was synchronized to the Chernobyl accident and fit in beautifully, as I say, with the summit meeting in Japan of Ronald Reagan. Every year there's a crowd in Germany from the Sudeten, a group of Germans who were part of Czechoslovakia until after World War II, and they were strongly pro-Hitler and pro-Nazi, and they fled to West Berlin, where they have an annual convention every year. And last year there was a attempted riot or demonstrations to join the two Berlins and to give Czechoslovakia back to its own form of government instead of control the Soviet Union. And after Reagan went to Bitburg and put the wreath on the cemeteries, Helmut Kohl went to talk for his annual meeting with the Sudeten group. There were 75,000 of them that met May the 19th. Now, if the Soviet Union was dropping atomic particles as of May the 4th up to the 31st, it's very interesting that 15 days later, Helmut Kohl, the chancellor who set up the Bitburg ceremonies, is telling the Sudetens, a crowd of 75,000, that Russia should make payments of $90 million for the damage that they have done to Germany. And the Soviet Union answered back and said, there's no proof that we did this. They said within days of the accident, $90 million of harm has been done to agriculture in Germany, and maybe the harm is being done by this nuclear reactor in Germany that was leaking since May the 4th, and Helmut Kohl was using it for his political rally of the Sudetens as of March the 19th. The article from the Washington Times said Kohl was speaking to a crowd of 75,000 people at the annual reunion of the Sudetens. He said that this nuclear reactor has caused so much damage that they want to take it to the World Court. A man named Wolfgang von Geldern, a high-ranking ministry official from West Germany, was quoted as saying, West Germany would take its case to the International Court of Justice if Moscow refuses to pay Germany $90 million, and Helmut Kohl is saying Gorbachev should have addressed the question of plans for compensation, the damages to West Germany, and we'll take it to the World Court. That's what he was talking about, which becomes a double scandal if, in fact, it was the German radiation that was leaking from that plant. Now, the Sudeten area is a nest of agents set up to instigate World War III, to take the land away from Russia that they took after World War II. And there are references to the Sudeten specifically in several books. One is Galen's Spy of the Century, written by Mr. Cookridge, and it refers to a criminal, literally a war criminal, Captain Theodore Oberlander, who worked with death squads and planned to kill large amounts of people in the Ukraine and was responsible for horrendous murders. And he began to be an aide in West Germany after the war to Konrad Adenauer, the first prime minister or president of Germany after the war. And during the war, he was working for the Galen operation in the Ukraine and in that area around Kiev and the Ukraine. And in 1942, he was teaching these various Russians who became part of the Nazi Germany entourage how to blow up operations of infiltration, of sabotage, of blowing up bridges, of railways, and working for the Nazis as saboteurs inside Russia. And after the war, Oberlander was one of the bigwigs, and is today, of the World Anti-Communist League. Mr. John Singlaub, who's the chairman of it, and who works with the National Security Council and in now the White House with Ronald Reagan, has Mr. Oberlander from Europe and the Sudeten working with Wackel at a time that in 1986, whipping up these stories at a time when Reverend Moon of World Anti-Communist League is also publishing articles about the operations in the Soviet Union and making a real propaganda media thing instead of sticking to the facts. Another book about Oberlander and the Sudeten is called The New Germany and the Old Nazis, because the old Nazis are now the current Nazis working with our White House and national security and with the Vatican and the Knights of Malta. It was written by T.H. Tetens, published by Marzani and Munsell in 1961. And this explains the relationship of Mr. Oberlander and John Foster Dulles to a Mr. Richard Saleh and a Mr. Becker, who worked with Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, and this news about Chernobyl reads like Goebbels' diary of propaganda. And these men worked with Mr. Ribbentrop and then with the United States government. And this book, New Germany and Old Nazis, cites in 1961 people from Congress, 36 senators and 57 congressmen that went along with the Nazis that were responsible for mass murders and then were put into the government in Germany and now work with our Defense Department and our policies. And there's certain congressmen listed here that were in touch with these Nazis and still are. Among them was Prescott Bush and Strom Thurmond and Wallace Bennett. That's from the Mullen Associates in Utah. I mentioned just briefly last week, a few things, or 2 weeks ago, on the Mullen Public Relations Office that set up the Watergate entry and is a public relations office for the Youth Organization and for Covert Action and Counterintelligence, Free Cuba Committee, and so forth. Now, Mr. Oberlander worked, described in the New Germany and the old Nazis. He worked as part of a resettlement program where the deaths of hundreds of millions of Poles and Czechs and Ukrainians would happen after the war. Reinhard Gehlen said they would take 30 million and make them slaves, and 40 million would be killed. So to release a little atomic powder and to blow up a station there, such as Chernobyl, whether it took all four or was closed down with one, the Germans have had no love for this particular territory. Also in the news, there are a lot of articles. Jean Kirkpatrick had one just this week on top of the Chernobyl story on breaking the Yalta Agreement. And there are a lot of questions on why the boundary lines remain. And the Chernobyl thing, I believe, is a Cold War operation along with the sabotage of these officers planned a long time ago. And simultaneous with the nuclear leaks and the distrust of Gorbachev, Jean Kirkpatrick was talking about the Yalta Agreement. And in the book, The New Germany and Old Nazis, Mr. Tietens, in talking about Oberlander, who's currently active with our administration, the present administration, and the past ones, he cites that the motives for race hatred and the obsession of the Germans, not only for Jews, but for Poles and Ukrainians and Russians by the millions, was going on during the war. According to official German figures, not Russian figures, German figures, of the 55 million victims of World War II, 35 million non-combatants were killed in Eastern Europe alone as a result of war and occupation. The large groups of Sudeten Germans, and that's where Helmut Kohl was talking this last weekend or the week before, to 78,000, the large group of Sudeten Germans in Poland played a vital role in Hitler's Holocaust. They filled the ranks of the Gestapo, the Waffen-SS. They fought fanatically to Germanize the Slavic land, and it was in light of this record that the Allies decided at Yalta and Potsdam to set this group back to the borders of when the war ended in breaking up Berlin, East and West Berlin, that the Nazis had fled the eastern part of Europe and went to West Berlin to retrench again, and that the plotters were sent home in order to stop their conspiracies. And in 1945, fate caught up with the Sudeten Germans, is written in this book, and they were simply sent home to Germany, and they were forced to leave Czechoslovakia. They wanted back, and of course the statistics from Germany said they were responsible for 55 million people dying. And if you wonder why there's a boundary or a separation place where the Germans, East and West Germans, break off and the Soviet sphere of influence remains, it's because of the 55 million people, 35 million that were civilians that weren't even in uniform and weren't part of the massacre. Now, this Dr. Theodore Oberlander, who works with Reverend Moon and Arnaud de Borchgrave and the very people printing these articles in the Washington Times, Dr. Oberlander joined Adenauer's cabinet in 1953. When he was suggested to be part of the cabinet, they brought up the Lemberg massacre in South Poland, where 5,000 Jews were slaughtered. Dr. Oberlander does not deny that he was the commanding officer. And it seems funny that now with Kurt Waldheim wanting to be president of the United Nations, not the president of Austria after being head of the United Nations, if they just brought up the amount of people he sent to the death chamber, it wouldn't have mattered anyway. Because in Germany, they brought up the subject of massacres in the Ukraine, and it's in the Ukraine, in this area where this reactor went off, that the problems were brought out of Mr. Gorbachev. And there are many people of Reinhard Gehlen's team inside of that area. Gehlen was head of Hitler's intelligence of the Eastern Division. He was given a flat $22 million off the top, and much more later by Alan Dulles, director of the CIA, the same Dulles whose daughter married the head of the publishing firm in Vienna who recommended Waldheim to be secretary of the prime minister of Vienna. Now, at the time the Chernobyl blast took place, experiments were taking place there, and that could be another way to sabotage the plant. The articles, this one's from the LA Times, experiments at Chernobyl underway at the time of the blast. And they were being conducted there on the reactor when the explosion and fire occurred. Moscow was notified within less than 3 hours of what took place, and the nuclear safety officials said that they had lowered the nuclear heat to 6 or 7% of their entire capacity because they were going to make annual repairs on the equipment, and in that same place, experiments and research work were being done when something went wrong. This is Los Angeles Times, May the 22nd. A major thing took place, and the experiments, they weren't sure had any relation to the accident. They'll come out with a report eventually, and they didn't know if they were connected with checking some of the systems of the station. So people, scientists, working inside of that plant could be tampering with things because they were working right there at the time. They could say they were misguided experiments or whatever, and some of the people inside of there died right away. One in particular was buried right inside of the machinery there, but somebody was tampering with, not tampering, working on the plant at the time that this happened, and that would be a perfect way to sabotage and get out of that situation. Now, the newspaper synchronicity of articles at the time these events take place is always very interesting. The Los Angeles Times had an article April the 27th. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster happened April the 26th, but the world press didn't know till the 28th and 29th. So nobody knew it at the time except the people in Russia. Allegedly, it was only picked up by those in Sweden, unless it was a agent provocateur kind of thing, and the powers that be knew about it. Because the interesting article, a long article, a quarter of a page, entire page of the newspaper, April 27th, the very next day, when nobody knows about it except the Russians, a long article, huge numbers of Soviet rebels collaborated with invading Nazis. And this is the story of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and then up in the Ukraine, in the area, it's got a map of Kiev. Interestingly enough, this is the day after the explosion when nobody in the West was supposed to know, with a map of Kiev and the Ukraine in the Los Angeles Times. And the gist of the article is that there have been a lot of people inside the Soviet Union that collaborated with the invading Nazis. The article says in the Soviet Union, where bore the brunt of the war with Germany, which was 55 million killed, 20 million just holding one city, collaborators appeared on a large scale unequaled in modern times. Large numbers of non-Russian ethnic minorities seized what they perceived as a chance for liberation and independence. Rand Corporation, and this is the third article from a different newspaper citing the Rand Corporation as if they're the only people that know anything about nuclear reactors or what's inside of Russia. And this time, third time, Rand is referring to the fact that a lot of people prefer Nazism to communism. In fact, the excuse in this article for Russians joining the Nazis and fighting with the Nazis to infiltrate or sabotage the Soviet Union cited the fact that Stalin was hard on a lot of people. There was a drought where 3 million died in the Ukraine and 10 million perished in Soviet labor camps. So if you add that up, the reason for the people inside the Soviet Union joining the Nazis was that approximately 13 million died at the hands of Joseph Stalin. But the plans to take the Ukraine of Reinhard Gehlen were to kill 70 million right off the bat, and that 70 million described in Gehlen's Spy of the Century, well, 30 million would be slaves and work till starvation, 40 million would be killed outright, would be added to the 55 million, if you follow the numbers, that died during World War II. So that's 125 million versus 13 million. So the score on that seems to be lopsided in the favor of mass murders rather than a few million murders. None of this makes sense, you understand. I'm just being really cynical. I'm giving you the real facts that have been cited over and over again on Hitler's plans for the Ukraine, written by these people. But none of this at all makes sense any more than the 36 million starving in Africa today and the 20 million that have AIDS. We just throw numbers around like you throw pebbles into the ocean. They lose their meaning, and we do become numb by these facts. But this article in the LA Times goes on, and it says, despite Nazi brutality and the dismal record of German occupation policies in these territories, Soviet non-Russians collaborated and fought with the Germans for Nazism because it was the lesser of two evils. Now, this was written by Robert Gillette, Los Angeles Times, which is literally saying to the world, one day after the Chernobyl, but which nobody's going to know about, and Sweden isn't going to report until a day later on the 28th, that people do prefer Nazism to socialism, that there's two evils and they prefer, and it's all right. He's literally saying, I can understand why they do it, and the timing of it is important. The article goes on, 1 million Poles were taken out of Russia during the war in 1941, but were returned after the war, and these events caused many to identify with the invading foreign power. Now, it's sort of like when Jimmy Carter wouldn't go into Iran and take the hostages, and they all came home alive. You'd think that they would appreciate the policy of slowness or care, taking care of them. 1 million Poles were put away during the war, but they all returned. And so the logic of this writer is, therefore, they became Nazis, because when the war was over, they were sympathetic to the Nazis. The fact that they lived tells you something, because they could have been among the 55 million in the area that were killed and didn't live. But anyway, this was synchronized just at the same time period, and it's an article to explain how 400,000 of the people who favored Nazism over what was happening in the Soviet Union got visas to emigrate to the United States. Now, a lot of those worked in the Dallas-Fort Worth area with Lee and Marina Oswald when they came home from Russia. They came in from the Tolstoy Foundation, from the Greek Orthodox Church, and the CIA foundations. 400,000 of those people from Eastern Europe who preferred Nazism to the communism were brought to the United States, and this explains a lot of the people behind the news media describing the events of Chernobyl, and also explains possibly the people in Russia who could make the Chernobyl happen, the explosion happen there. Well, this is Mae Brussell, and it's 8 o'clock. It's time of the hour. It's top of the hour. I'm going to have to cut it short now. I got 1 second. Thank you for the articles and books you send to me, and I'll be back with you next week. This is KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California.